On the morning of December 28, 2025, something unprecedented happened at the Aladdin shopping center in Tehran's Grand Bazaar. Electronics merchants began pulling down their shutters for the first time in history. With the dollar exchange rate breaking through 145,000 tomans, continuing business had simply become impossible. Through every alley, a single chant echoed: "A merchant would rather die than suffer humiliation." There is a deep irony in this moment. 46 years ago, these very bizarre merchants were the backbone of Ayatollah Khomeini's Islamic Revolution. They were its financiers, its most passionate supporters, and now their descendants were pouring into the streets to stand against the very regime they had helped build. Within a single day, the protests swept across the entire country, becoming the largest uprising Iran had seen since 1979 Islamic Revolution. So what exactly happened? In January 2026, internal figures the Iranian government had desperately tried to conceal were leaked to the public. In just the first 48 hours of protests, January 8th and 9th, a minimum of 30,000 to 36,500 demonstrators were estimated to have been killed. Time, The Guardian, and Iran International all reported the figures. But this massacre did not happen overnight. Behind it lay years of slow-burning economic catastrophe. Iran's currency, the rial, was in free fall. In early November 2025, the exchange rate stood at 1.07 million rials to the dollar. Just 2 months later, in January 2026, it had blown past 1.5 million rials, eventually climbing to 1.75 million. Iranians watched helplessly as their savings turned to dust before their eyes. Prices spiraled out of control. Inflation hit 48.6% in October 2025, and food prices surged an average of 72% compared to the year before. The World Bank projected that Iran's economy would contract in both 2025 and 2026, with annual inflation approaching 60%. Iran's GDP per capita had collapsed from around $8,000 in 2012 to below $5,000 by 2024, a 40% drop in national living standards within just 12 years. Even more shocking was a figure released by Iran's own Ministry of Social Welfare in 2024. 57% of the Iranian population was experiencing some degree of malnutrition. In a country sitting on one of the world's largest oil reserves, more than half the population could not get enough to eat. Does that make any sense? The country's infrastructure was crumbling too. Starting in February 2025, rolling blackouts of 3 to 4 hours hit every part of Iran every single day. The national power grid faced a shortfall of 32,000 megawatts, nearly half its total capacity. A doctor in Tehran described it plainly. The lights go out in the middle of surgery. The emergency generator kicks in, but it doesn't always work. A patient's life depends on the government's competence. The power crisis was gutting Iranian industry. With no reliable electricity, half of Iran's industrial facilities shut down operations. Production schedules became impossible to plan, and in 2024 alone, industrial losses from power shortages exceeded 44 trillion tomans. Jobs vanished. The economy kept deteriorating. Iran was losing its future. In a desperate move, the government announced in May 2025 that all government offices, banks, and administrative institutions would be closed every Thursday until the end of summer, with working hours slashed to 6 a.m. through 1 p.m. It was, in effect, a public admission that the state could no longer function normally, a white flag raised in broad daylight. The water crisis was equally dire. Rivers and reservoirs were drying up. Iran, once considered the breadbasket of the Middle East, had reached a point where even farming had become a struggle. The CEO of Tehran's water and wastewater company was blunt. "The current state of our dams is deeply alarming. We simply do not have enough water." A country with oil but no power, rivers with no water. This is the tragic reality of Iran in 2026. How did a nation once admired across the entire Middle East fall this far? Two forces working in tandem brought it to its knees: external pressure from international sanctions and internal disease of corruption and incompetence. The decisive blow came in 2018 when President Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, and reimposed sweeping sanctions. One by one, Iran's major oil customers walked away. International banks severed their ties. Iran was effectively expelled from the global financial system. Then, in September 2025, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany triggered the Snapback mechanism under the 2015 nuclear agreement, restoring UN sanctions after Iran continued advancing its nuclear and missile programs. The consequences for Iran's oil revenue were devastating. Iranian crude was selling for as little as $7 to $8 per barrel at a time when global oil prices hovered around $80. Iran was forced to sell its most valuable resource to China at less than a tenth of the market rate, with no other buyer willing to take the risk. But sanctions alone do not explain the scale of this collapse. The rot from within ran far deeper. Masoud Nili, a former economic advisor to President Rouhani, said it plainly in a public forum in April 2025. Iran's economy has fundamentally collapsed due to decades of corruption, lack of productivity, and excessive dependence on oil revenues. The Islamic Revolutionary Guards, or IRGC, had long since transformed from a military organization into Iran's largest economic conglomerate. Its reach extended across oil and gas, construction, telecommunications, and even cryptocurrency. According to multiple reports, the IRGC was running an annual fuel smuggling operation worth roughly $8 billion, siphoning money that should have been reinvested in the country's energy infrastructure. The government tried to crack down on border security, but it was futile because the IRGC's own leadership was neck-deep in the scheme. Foreign policy drained the economy further. According to the U.S. Treasury Department, the IRGC transferred over $1 billion to Lebanon's Hezbollah in just the first 10 months of 2025. While Iranian children suffered from malnutrition on the streets of Tehran, the government was sending $1 billion to militias in Beirut. Corruption was no longer a problem within the system. Corruption had become the system itself, and it was devouring everything around it. For ordinary Iranians, taking to the streets was the last option left, but the government's response was merciless. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and senior officials ordered live fire against the demonstrators, and the military and security forces obeyed. On January 6th, a sit-in occupation began inside the Grand Bazaar. Security forces fired tear gas, but the merchants refused to scatter. These were people who remembered, or whose parents remembered, that their community had built this revolution, and they believed they could end it. Cracks began to appear within the regime itself. Alireza Jirani Hokambad, a senior Iranian official at the United Nations, applied for asylum in Switzerland. Reports followed of multiple Iranian diplomats seeking refuge across Europe. Even those who had been the public face of the regime were abandoning it. Around 200 economists and former officials signed an open letter demanding diplomatic normalization with the United States and Europe, fiscal restructuring, and decisive anti-corruption measures, calling for nothing less than a complete transformation of how the country is governed. But the IRGC and the hardline power structure showed no willingness to compromise. They seemed to be prepared to burn the country down before giving up their grip on power. The United States and Iran are currently engaged in negotiations, but a breakthrough looks unlikely. Experts are not ruling out military conflict, and American strategic assets have been quietly repositioning across the Middle East. Iran now stands at a crossroads. External pressure from international sanctions and the internal disease of corruption and incompetence are simultaneously threatening to bring down a 46-year-old Islamic Republic. The winter protests of 2025 and 2026 are not just another uprising. They may well be the signal that an era is drawing to a close. Will the Islamic regime fall? Will the people of Iran finally know freedom? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.